I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
We begin with another grim chapter in Spain's coronavirus crisis. Over 10,000 people have now died from complications linked to COVID-19. That's after
Italy has overtaken China to have the world's highest reported death toll from the coronavirus.
But the number of deaths in Germany has remained lower than many other countries, whether in Europe or around the world. Joining us.
The very future of the European Union is at risk if it does not do more to help countries hit by coronavirus. That's the warning from the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte.
Overseas, we are hearing this morning of a massive COVID-19 recovery package that EU leaders finalized earlier today. An unprecedented stimulus amount.
On today's episode, we're speaking with Rosa Balfour, the director of Carnegie Europe, about the challenges and opportunities facing Europe as we look to the world after the pandemic. Thanks for joining us, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Rosa, when the pandemic first hit, many countries in Europe struggled to contain the virus, as we know. Italy, Spain, and the UK, among others, saw rapidly rising infection and death rates at first and then implemented strict lockdowns. Some, such as Sweden, took a totally different approach. How are things going now?
Coordination has improved enormously. At the beginning, everybody was going in different directions and panic really did set in. But it didn't take that long for the EU member states and the institutions to get their act together and improve coordination. Having said this, every country did take measures that reflected their national cultures, their democratic traditions, and also the severity of the coronavirus pandemic. So in Italy and Spain, for instance, these were the countries that were first hit. They took draconian measures, and then later they were able to relax. At the moment, things are not going so well in Spain, so there's a bit of a return in the spike. But by and large, member states did manage to communicate the different ways in which they were dealing with the pandemic. And to coordinate on the general measures in terms of health, in terms of vaccine, in terms of, and most importantly, in terms of economic recovery.
On the show, we've heard this consistent theme of how the pandemic is exposing stark structural inequalities around the world. How is this manifesting in Europe?
Well, in Europe, we need to be aware of differences of inequalities within states and inequalities among the EU member states. Within states, as in other countries and other parts of the world, we've seen that the coronavirus affected ethnic minorities, those living in crowded cities. And I think that pattern has been largely similar across the world. Within the EU, we did see that the wealthier countries with high quality health systems, and healthcare is free in Europe, they actually responded to the coronavirus pandemic far better. And this is the case of Germany, of course. And the stark difference would be, for instance, with countries such as Romania and Bulgaria, which have whose health infrastructure is less good and whose doctors and nurses, many of them have actually emigrated to countries like Germany because they have better job opportunities. So these dynamics played out. But we also saw, for instance, in Italy, paradoxical case. Northern Italy has very good health structure, but it was so badly hit by the virus that it didn't really deal with the crisis very well in the first few weeks. Whereas Southern Italy, which is much poorer and has a less efficient health infrastructure, dealt with it better. But that's largely a consequence of numbers. So I think sociologists and historians of the future actually will have a lot of variables to work with to understand more precisely how the coronavirus hit health infrastructure, inequalities. But what's important in Europe is that it really underlines the differences between the member states and the need for greater convergence among the member states in terms of economic development and equality.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. What were some of the things that you're seeing along those trend lines?
Well, what is interesting is Europe had more or less just come out of a 10-year economic crisis, which started in 2008, basically, with the crisis of the financial markets. And the response of the EU was to impose austerity measures on those countries that were most badly hit by the Eurozone. And then comes the pandemic, and it so happens that the same countries that were so badly hit by the Eurozone were also hit by the coronavirus. And so the debate in Brussels became about how can the EU support these countries that have been going through a decade of troubles. And there was a big division, which was not due to the pandemic. It was a division that existed beforehand, which came out again. And the division between those frugal states who argue that Southern Europe needs to pursue reform in order to access EU funding, and the Southern states saying we need greater solidarity, we need to share because we're part of the same European Union project. In July, and this was a historic decision, the argument of the Southern states became accepted by all the member states. Obviously, with negotiations, it was a very long summit, but it is a historic change. So the hope is that with the recovery plan, some of those pre-existing inequalities among the member states, such as economic divergence, can actually start to be addressed. And the other hope is that the elites, the political decision makers in Europe, will be able to dovetail that economic recovery plan with the plans that were put in place earlier in the year for supporting a digital transformation of the economy and a Green Deal. So if the crisis can be used as an opportunity to upgrade Europe's economy, Europe's infrastructure, Europe's talent skills, then there could well be light at the end of the tunnel, even if we're not out of the coronavirus tunnel yet.
We'll be right back to talk about some of Europe's regional challenges.
Angela Merkel is warning that the European Union must prepare for a no-deal Brexit, as trade talks with the UK continue to show little progress.
The Brussels protest is one of many to take place across Europe. An international movement is taking hold, demanding change.
The threat of further violence looms over Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko has told security services to clamp down.
The EU and NATO are trying to ratchet up the pressure on Russia over Alexei Navalny's deliberate poisoning. In a statement Thursday, EU officials said the use of chemical weapons is completely unacceptable under any circumstances. That constitutes a serious breach of international law and international human rights standards.
Rosa, Europe is facing a host of challenges close to home beyond the coronavirus pandemic. Let's start with Brexit, which has been a consistent issue for the EU over 4 years now. For anyone who might have lost the thread recently, where do things stand now?
Nowhere. Right now, things don't stand in a very good place. At the moment, the negotiations between the UK and the EU are in a bit of a black hole. It's unclear as to whether the UK government is posturing to extract a better deal or better concessions from Brussels, or whether it's actually committed to a no-deal exit. It is possible that because the coronavirus pandemic is having such a huge impact on the UK economy, those hardline Brexiteers might want to take advantage of the opportunity to pursue a no-deal Brexit, which would have huge economic consequences, but those consequences could be blurred in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and its own economic consequences. So this is a possibility. And at the moment, tension is high between Brussels and London, between the UK and Ireland, because the UK has announced that it might not want to respect international commitments made. So it's a very tense moment in those relations. It will be critical that the EU and the UK work out, I won't say a deal, but work out some arrangement so that both sides can move forward. The UK definitely wants to move forwards. The government has a set of plans it wants to carry out, and the EU as well. They want to move out of this tunnel that has absorbed a lot of energies on both sides since 2016. But at the moment, the situation is very tense, is not very promising, and it is possible that the two sides will not reach an arrangement, and that therefore the economic impact of the divorce will be hard on both sides, but most importantly on the UK.
And I understand there are anti-EU sentiments in other countries, France and the Netherlands, to name a couple. Do you think that the European project is really at stake? And has the pandemic played any role in accelerating or decelerating this trend?
There indeed, anti-EU sentiments are growing. They have been growing for the past 20 years or so. They fluctuate a little bit depending on the situation. So, for instance, Italy is an interesting country because it used to be the most pro-European. Then, because of lack of solidarity, because of populist movements there, it became very anti-European. But at the moment in Italy, nobody is being critical of the EU because the EU has actually performed quite well. So on the surface, we're seeing populist movements and anti-EU movements going up and down depending on circumstances. What's happening, however, below this surface is that there is growing disenchantment with politics a bit more generally.
Well, that's happening in the United States as well and around the world.
Exactly. So there's a global trend, and this does affect the EU, but in a way more indirectly. The problem lies with democracies at national level. I would argue it lies with the insufficient upgrading of democratic structures, which has led to many people feeling left behind or left out, not participating in public life. And that is the reason for which populism, anti-EU sentiments, nationalism will continue to be there, regardless of who's actually going to be leading these movements. So we need to keep that in mind.
Well, you just mentioned nationalism. To continue this political conversation, we've seen the rise of far-right parties and leaders. What do you think is driving that? Is it similar to the anti-EU sentiment? How would you sort of tie these things together?
There are two broad interpretations. One is about economic inequality and how class structures, access to education have changed over the past 2 or 3 decades. And the other argument is about culture, fear of immigration, fear of losing one's identity. I actually think that these touch the surface. They certainly influence the way populist movements or nationalist movements, evolve over time. For instance, when there was a refugee crisis in 2015, 2016 in Europe, the far right emerged as a threatening party against the arrival of refugees fleeing Syria and Afghanistan. But that's not the real reason. I do think the real reason is to be found in the fact that democratic structures have been left behind in terms of political participation. Political parties are not playing the same function they used to play as an intermediary between government and citizens. So that there's some deeper structural reasons for which there is great disenchantment with democracy and an appreciation of those who do not care for the institutions of representative democracy, an appreciation for those who cast themselves as representing the people, bypassing the institutions, talking directly with the people through Twitter, social media, etc. And that undermines the democratic structures that we have created. So if I were to look at all the cases across Europe, there will be some countries in which the economic crisis produced populist movements, other countries in which it didn't produce populist movements. There'll be other cases in which immigration was the cause for these populist movements. But actually what brings them together is the fact that democracy has been hollowed out. And with respect to the EU, this is even more evident because the EU is one step further away from the citizen. And so it's a very easy target to blame for lack of political participation or for people feeling left behind.
One of the key features of the right-wing parties has been this anti-immigration, xenophobic rhetoric that you just mentioned, and yet we're also seeing a global movement of reckoning around colonialism, slavery, and continued systemic racism. We've talked about this elsewhere on the podcast. And so it's interesting to put these things together where you see mass protests about police brutality and colonial legacies, and also this rising nationalism. How are these two opposing ideologies playing out within the dynamic that you just talked about?
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, I think the Black Lives Matter, this awakening with respect to the history of large parts of our population, which has been absolutely, completely forgotten. I'm half British. At school, you don't actually learn about the British Empire. It's as if people didn't know that it existed and the responsibilities of the British Empire. So it's an amazing awakening. But on the other hand, and I think we're seeing this in the US, there is a high risk that, especially if the protest movements are somehow manipulated by extremist violent groups, there's a huge risk that it feeds into the polarization. And the problem is that on the far right in particular, be it because of fears of crime, be it because of ideological conviction, it's very hard to reach out to establish a dialogue between these two opposing movements. So it tends to feed into the polarization dynamics that we're seeing elsewhere in politics, and it doesn't help the creation of national dialogues, healing processes that can lead to understanding the injustices that certain minority groups have endured historically. So there's a risk that, it's a risk that I think is, in many respects, it's worth running, because the awakening is really challenging our acquired view of history, national history, our acquired view of multiculturalism. And these are all themes that have been very much in crisis in recent years. But at the same time, it ought to be down to political elites to seize this as an opportunity to establish forms of national dialogue and to promote the design of new narratives. Because
that would also, I think, connect to what you just said about, failure of democratic institutions, that they're not in some ways healthy enough to sustain this dialogue. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that sort of what you're getting at?
I guess, there's I guess what's happening in the US is hugely visible in Europe. What's happening in Europe is less visible even in Europe, partly because it's on a smaller scale. But I think the problem is precisely that you need to find the spaces in order to have that dialogue. And insofar as you still have, monopolies of power, such as the police, causing violent incidents on the streets, it's going to be very difficult to find the terms through which engage these different groups in a dialogue. And that has to be done, I think, at top-down level, not just at bottom-up level. At the level of communities, this is happening across Europe. Certainly, I'm sure it's happening in the US as well, but it's happening in some of the boroughs. I'm based in Brussels. It's a very multi-ethnic city. And some of the boroughs have, difficult interethnic or interreligious relations, but bottom up, there are people there who are working hard to build communities. You need that message to come from the top as well. And I'm not entirely sure that the European political elite has identified this issue quite as much as it should do.
Belarus has been in the news recently following a contested election, mass protests, and a brutal crackdown ordered by President Lukashenko. The EU announced sanctions, and the European Council held an emergency summit in August. What role can Europe play in this context?
Europe has always been very cautious towards Russia. Many countries have been willing to engage in some form of dialogue with Russia. But Russia's increasing interference in the domestic politics in Europe, what is happening in Belarus, and the poisoning of Navalny are beginning to shift the position of some member states, so much so that there was even talk in Germany of interrupting Nord Stream 2.
Right, significant.
That would be symbolically, because the project is actually very close to being finished, so it wouldn't make, and it would just be a symbolic gesture, and it's unlikely to happen. Europe has always been caught in this dilemma: proximity with Russia and the degree to which Russia can influence European politics has made it very cautious of taking strong measures. And this is what's happening in the Belarus context. Having said this, it is also unclear to what extent the EU and Europe could actually change things within Belarus. It has very little leverage. It has been supporting civil society, but it's by no means as influential as Russia is. And it has very few tools that would resonate with the Lukashenko entourage. It can sanction individuals. It will sanction individuals. It can sanction individuals in Russia. But it's been very reluctant to take a hard position towards Russia, largely because of energy and because of historic diplomatic relations. So Europe is a little bit caught in a bind on Belarus, and is relying that, the whole narrative is the change has to come from within. Europe doesn't recognize the Lukashenko victory, but the whole narrative is to reassure Russia that Europe is not going to push Belarusians towards a pro-European revolution.
And do you think the poisoning of Navalny changes this at all?
Well, the poisoning of Navalny, it's interesting because, so basically in Europe, you have countries that are closest to Russia, such as the Baltic states and Poland, who have been in the Soviet orbit before the end of the Cold War, who are highly suspicious of Russia and are pushing the rest of the EU to take a tougher approach. Then you have other countries such as Germany and France, which have very strong economic and energy ties with Russia and have been much softer. So on the European side, it has to be understood there's always this negotiation going on. And the point of unity is somewhere in the middle. But it has to be said that since 2014, i.e. since Crimea, Europe hasn't moved away from that unity, whereas in other issues, it's conspicuously disunited. On this point of balance within, they have managed to find that unity. The fact that Navalny is in Germany, I think, brings the whole question close to public opinion. And that is perhaps what is new for Germany. So Germany has always had a commercial policy which is deeply tied with Russia, and has kind of separated that from its foreign and diplomatic policy. But now that Navalny is actually in Germany, in a hospital there, public opinion is much more aware of what is happening. And that's why Angela Merkel signaled the possibility of ending Nord Stream, where, of course, the US has been pushing Germany to do that. So that, too, has been in the public debate. But even if it were to do that, it would probably be a symbolic move rather than a substantive move. Germany does depend on Russia for its energy, and it hasn't pursued policies of energy diversification for the past 10 years when, it was clear that this dependency was not going to be helpful. So it's caught in a bind. Germany is caught in a bind on this front.
We'll be right back to talk more about Europe's evolving role in the world.
China's aggressive behavior has been begging a big question. Did Germany, did Europe get too friendly with China?
Huawei, the world's leading manufacturer of 5G network gear. A U.S. campaign seeks to have allies around the world dump the supplier for security reasons. Europe has become the focal point of that campaign.
Over 2 days, the EU-Africa Business Forum brought together participants from both continents, including entrepreneurs looking for funding. One such is the founder.
In your piece for Carnegie's new digital magazine, The Day After, Navigating a Post-Pandemic World, you write that Europe is simultaneously an arena for U.S. China rivalry and a player in the game. Tell us a bit more.
The US would like Europe to be more of a player and follow US policy on China. Europe and the EU can be much more of a player as well, taking decisions on how to deal with China. But China has been, for years, cultivating a policy whereby it is capable of influencing Europeans through economic dependency. And this is very true in the case of Germany and its trade. A lot of Germany's trade is with China, and it's pretty critical for Germany's economy. And then again, since the Eurozone crisis started, China has been investing in countries on the periphery of Europe that were most struck by austerity measures. Greece, Cyprus, Portugal. They've been making Italy. They've been making infrastructural investments. And these countries feel that sometimes they're not free to raise their voice about China more generally. So, for instance, in the EU, it used to be the norm to produce declarations of little political significance, but they used to produce declarations on human rights in China. Recently, some countries have been blocking the production of these declarations, and that is because they're under pressure from the Chinese government because of the investments that China has been making. So China has been trying to silence Europe, especially in the context of U.S.-China rivalry. Now, Europe has been evolving in its position towards China. There are significant signs of change recently. For instance, on foreign investments, on trade, on reciprocity. There are many areas in which Europe, Brussels, and European capitals are disagreeing quite strongly with China. So we're seeing a stronger response to China on several issues, 5G, Huawei. But nonetheless, it's unlikely to want to follow the US sort of black and white escalation of tensions with China. It would much prefer to de-escalate tensions. It would much prefer to deal with issues in the appropriate contexts. So it's not going to follow suit. It's not going to follow Washington's approach towards China. It will want to seek its own role, its own niche to deal with the several challenges that China poses.
So that tech war between the U.S. and China around Huawei, you think is emblematic of how Europe is approaching things more generally?
Well, it's a huge challenge for Europe. I'm sure Europe would rather not have to be put in that position, but it's actually forcing Europe to take a hard look at the nature of its relationship with China. There are a lot of interdependencies. There has been a lot of optimism with respect to China's rise. But I think ultimately, Europe will seek a slightly different end goal. Whereas at the moment, the US administration wants to prevent China's rise further. I think Europe accepts that, but it would like to see China play by the rules of the game. And it is willing to engage with China on those issues. So I think there's a slight different strategy in that front. Is it an opportunity? It's an opportunity for Europe to start taking a hard look of how it's been conducting its international relations. And I think it's an opportunity also to start looking at other areas for Europe's engagement. But on the whole, the US-China rivalry is destabilizing for the world and obviously for Europe as well.
And in terms of other spaces where Europe can play a leadership role, environmental policy is one. What specifically do you see Europe's role on the global stage being in terms of environmentalism? Where might it lead? Where might it stumble?
So Europe is already leading on in a number of areas, but of course it's small. It doesn't pollute as much as the other big polluters. So what it really needs to do is team up with other countries and use whatever diplomatic leverage it has in order to engage in conversations with those countries, which is why, for instance, China comes into this. It will be in the interest of the EU to bring China into a discussion precisely to look at what are the common goals, at least in terms of fighting global warming. There are other areas where the EU can also help. The EU still stands by its commitment to managing collectively global public goods, and there are fewer and fewer actors doing that. And I think this can be appreciated by other middle powers, but also by the least developed powers, which would benefit from this. And I think in a context in which we're still dealing with the coronavirus, thinking about public health as a global good is actually quite a nice quite an attractive proposition. And indeed, with the United States stepping out of WHO, the EU member states have decided to compensate at least the financial contribution to make sure that WHO can continue to work. So there are areas which are more about, shall we say, low politics, where Europe can still play a leadership role. And then I would also say if Europe manages to take advantage of this dire situation with respect to the coronavirus, take advantage of the recovery package that it approved to transform its economy towards digital, and the EU needs to catch up in the technological race, and a green economy, that could give a sense of renewal to what Europe stands for as a model, and it could engage with other countries in this transformation. Just think of North Africa and the Middle East. These are countries that have been wrought by conflict, also because of energy policy. Just imagine if the EU started to engage with them to talk about renewables, solar energy. This could change the equation a bit. We're talking long term, of course. This is not going to happen overnight. But these are paths for Europe to play a different role globally.
And I know one of the issues you think a lot about is Europe's relationship with the global South. Let's talk more about this. What should be on Europe's list of priorities as it thinks about that relationship?
Engaging with Europe's global South is definitely an opportunity. This is where the future is, where the future lies demographically, but also in terms of ideas, in terms of developing, for instance, what we've been saying about fighting the climate crisis and identifying renewables. But Europe, we have to be clear about this. Europe has past empires that have post-colonial legacies that sometimes are politically difficult to overcome. And Europe has also has developed very strict immigration policy. So all the young people that are looking for jobs and opportunities in Africa, they're struggling to come to Europe because Europe is reluctant to make its societies more multicultural and diverse, despite Europe's demographic problems. Europe is an aging continent. So there are lots of big obstacles, but at the same time, if Europe wants to diversify the types of relationships that it has around the world, if it wants to reduce its dependency on Russian gas, for instance, we talked about Russian gas, we talked about Chinese investments, it needs to start looking elsewhere. And Africa in particular is an area of European attention. Let's also say that if Europe doesn't look towards Africa, few others will. China's policies in Africa and in Africa are they're geared towards an extractive economy, and in Asia they're geared towards conquering spheres of influence. So Europe can be a much more benign international actor in these parts of the world, and can also be much more attractive for those countries, especially those that are transitioning towards democracy, especially those that have a stake in developing international order and multilateral institutions. So they're huge opportunities, but we should not pretend that there are no problems, and many of those problems derive from Europe's own history.
Well, in the U.S. China relationship, what you just talked about in terms of the global south, climate change, talking about Europe's evolving global leadership role, we've really seen, Europe try to fill the gap left by the U.S., as you just talked about with the World Health Organization. In terms of the U.S. elections, what do you think are the potential challenges or opportunities present for Europeans there, and how are they thinking about the next few months?
It is no secret that most Europeans are not particularly fond of the current US president, and that applies to the governments as well. The US has pursued a policy of hostility towards Europe. Europeans were naively unprepared for this. They always thought of being, the junior partner of the US, and they imagined the international context as one of benevolence, and it's Europe grew and did very well in this benevolent context. Once the context became much more hostile, Europeans were not prepared for it. Having said this, at the moment, my impression is that in most European capitals, there is a hope that Biden will win the elections and that the transatlantic relationship will return to a status quo ante. And I think this is wishful thinking. I think it would be much more productive if European capitals and Brussels thrashed out a few ideas of how to renew the transatlantic relationship and how to upgrade and mature and evolve in its own position, and think about what it is that Europe can offer to the US and where it is that Europe and the US actually diverge and have different opinions, and have a polite conversation about this, and design some plans for where Europe and the US can work together better.
And I'm sure you and your colleagues at Carnegie Europe will offer suggestions in that regard in the coming months as well. Thank you so much for being on, Rosa.
Thank you.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.